All right, looks like we're live. Holy crap! Holy. I don't know if anyone's going to pop in and see this, but if you do, at the end, that's when I'll take questions. I'm going to go ahead and get my recording ready for the podcast here. Just got to click the button. There we are. Welcome to Fables of Our Deconstruction, a podcast where we examine systems of faith and culture together as we grow as people. I'm your host, Dylan. If you like what you hear, check me out at patreon.com/Dylan. If you'd like to be on a future episode, leave me a message at 515-318-7569 or find Fables of Our Deconstruction on Anchor FM and leave me a voice message. Leave your name, otherwise I will keep you anonymous. Let's get into this. All right, so today I have quite a bit of stuff to cover. I want to mention I think I'm dealing with like seasonal head stuffiness, a little bit of I had like a little bit of itchy eyes last night. I was a little worried I had pink eye because my wife scared me, so I took a Benadryl. I was super tired, still pretty tired. I look like a crazy person if you're watching this on YouTube. However, I want to mention that I've been on residency the last week. It was really busy for me. I was in a small town in South Dakota known as Chamberlain. It's a big hunting area this time of year, and I had no internet access. I got very little done. I didn't get anywhere on my Kinktober stuff that I'm doing. So I'm behind, but I'm trying to stay peppy about it, and that's been an interesting challenge for me. But what's more compelling is that over that last week, I was staying at a Catholic school, and that's challenging knowing that I'm an atheist and I'm trying not to like butt heads with people. Yeah, I've got a podcast where I'm pretty darn critical, but I'm not going to tell people their beliefs are wrong while I'm hanging out with them, while they're giving me a place to stay, while they're feeding me food. So there's a lot going on in the back of my mind. I started listening to the Divine Comedy, otherwise known as Dante's Inferno. Boy, howdy, I'm excited to write content for that. I took a lot of notes. However, today we are talking about this book, Begin, that I picked up from the Answers in Genesis organization, famously run by Ken Ham, the guy who debated Bill Nye back, almost 10 years ago now. And I went down to Des Moines yesterday to do some work. I had to get my oil changed, so I took it to the dealership, and wouldn't you know it, I forgot my computer charger. I'm going to yawn a bunch today, aren't I? So wouldn't you know it, I forgot my computer charger. And here I sat with very little to do. So I was like, you know what, it's time to really take a chunk out of this book. I'd flipped through a little bit. I'd started kind of getting into it. But I was like, you know what, there's a lot of wide margins in this book. I'm going to write my own notes all over it. I got the book for free. So, figured let's just start tearing it apart. So I'm about a third of the way through. So here we go. Back in the summer, I received the book Begin from the Creation exhibit at the Iowa State Fair. It's an AIG, or Answers in Genesis, book. It claims to be written by Ken Ham. Hell, it even goes so far as to say that I may not reproduce it in any way unless I'm using brief quotations in articles and reviews. So I guess this is a review. Before we kick off, I have 2 comments. Actually, you know what? Let's make it 3. 1, I'm only about a third of the way through the book, like I said before. 2, I don't know what Ken Ham actually wrote, aside from his own brief quotations. Much of Begin seems to be ripped directly from the English Standard Version of the Bible. I know I can read most versions of the Bible for free online, so it's kind of funny that Mr. Ham doesn't want us reproducing his book, when most of the book in and of itself is a reproduction. Each page has its own little one-liners or blurbs about the verses, often reacting in ways that say, "See, aren't I right?" There's another author listed in this as well, and let me double check on their name. One hot second here while we do some live double checking. Bodie Hodge. I don't know what parts they wrote either, so that's a really curious issue. And number 3, while I was doing research on this book online, literally just before the show started, I was wondering why would they say don't reproduce when I got it for free. But it turns out this book on the Answers in Genesis website is $9.99 for the softcover book that I have. It's a reasonable price for a book, but if you could just go to the fair and get it for free, do that. Ultimately, what's frustrating about Begin is that in order to read it, you must assume that God is real and that the true God is the God of Christianity, and possibly the version of God that Mr. Ham adheres to, whichever version that might be. It's nearly impossible to try to read this book from a critical perspective without wanting to rip your own head off and mail it screaming directly to Answers in Genesis. That being said, we are off on a new path of reading and researching thanks to Ken Ham and Bodhi Hodge. So let's tear apart Genesis. Yes, I know this gets done ad nauseum, but I agree with Ken. If we're going to understand Christianity at all, we need to start at the beginning. Today, we'll focus on the creation myth, or myths, because there certainly seems to be two in the Bible. You all probably know the 7-day creation story and God creating things with divine commands. You probably know that on day 7, he rested and blessed the day. That's the claim as to why Christians attend church on Sundays and have weekends, and we could dive into the whole Sabbath thing, but that would be a huge rabbit hole of its own. But what if I told you that it seems that there are two myths in the same book of the same Bible? Yeah, there are versions that strive harder to rectify this issue or blur it, but I'm going to work from Ken Ham's book Begin and Christianity.com as my primary sources. If you want even more of this, go find Hemet Meta on YouTube or on Only Sky, or if you want even deeper dives, go watch The Genetically Modified Skeptic. Drew over there does an amazing job and touches deeply on subjects like this. Christianity.com does some gymnastics to explain things away when it comes to the issues with the creation myth in the Bible. In Genesis 1, we have the typical 7-day myth. Then in Genesis 2, it jumps into God creating Adam and then presenting him with things like animals. In the book Begin, it is definitely written in a way that avoids these issues. And I think if it's the only interpretation of Genesis you ever read, you might gloss right over those problems. But as Christianity.com would point out, there are some interesting discrepancies. The big two being the words used to refer to God, one being Elohim in Genesis 1 and Yahweh in Genesis 2, and Genesis 1 using the word bara or created, and Genesis 2 using the term, now bear with me here, I don't really know Hebrew, yatsar, meaning fashioned. They're little things, really. It's not a huge issue per se. I would say the bigger of those two things is that God's name is different. Why would, if this is all divinely provided by God through man or men, why would this be different? Especially if you're like, hey, this is the first few books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, this is all written by Moses. Well, if Moses said that his best friend was Jeff, and then in the next chapter called his best friend Greg, I don't know why he would do that. It's not like saying Jeffrey and Jeff. It's not like they said Elohim and then Elo or something like that. They jump from Elohim to Yahweh. I think that's a bigger issue. But moreover, there's a contextual issue or difference with Genesis 1 being more of a typical story and Genesis 2 being more poetic. That's especially how Christian scholars and Christianity.com would like to look at it. There are numerous sources you can dig through on the differences between chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. It's frustrating for scholars and frustrating for critical reflection. Ham's book would have you run through it really quickly without stopping to ask any questions. He seems to prefer everything that way, but Christianity.com is more delicate. They acknowledge that segments of Genesis 2 do make it seem like there are contradictions to Genesis 1, with Adam being made first and then plants and animals afterward. And most apologists would assure us that what we're seeing is a misinterpretation and that we need a greater understanding of the context. And that exhausts me. Like, holy crap, does that exhaust me? If the Bible were truly God's word and he wanted us all to know it, he should be so much more deliberate in his wording and much less murky and confusing. If this book was meant for the illiterate, then God did something wrong. It's very clear that things like the Bible are very deliberate tools for people to interpret things to you in a way that is best convincing, as opposed to tools for you to interpret things yourself. However, I'm digressing. Genesis 2 leads us into the temptation of the Garden of Eden tale. This story is typically absent in Genesis 1, but if you can get over the issues between 1 and 2 and move into Eve being created, you start seeing good old douchebag God appearing. As you likely already know, a serpent tempts Eve into eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And she does so, and then she gets Adam to eat from it too. It leads to the whole, oh no, we're naked thing, and God demands to know what they have done. It's kind of weird that he asks, because if he's all knowing, he probably already knows what they've done. But God punishes the serpent by removing its legs and making it slither on the ground and eating the dirt. But then it gets weird because God punishes Adam and Eve with mortality and curses Adam to toil on the ground like a farmer. And then, even more so, curses Eve with deadly, painful childbirth. Like, you might die having kids. These are all punishments for eating from the tree. However, if we look at this constructively from the lens of a modern person, God's punishing victims. All three of them victims. Here's why I would say that. Because what the book Begin by Ken Ham really wants us to believe is that animals don't talk. There's a little blurb in there about animals don't talk. Something like parrots can talk, but they just make noises. They don't make sense. So for the serpent to talk, it must have been, some sort of vehicle for Satan. Satan, the devil, was speaking through the serpent. But there's a lot of problems with that because in Genesis 1, there's all this phrasing that, like, God created the earth and saw that it was good, and God created animals and saw that they were good, and then God created man and saw that he was good. And there's a lot of interpretation both in Christianity.com and in some of the blurbs in Begin that makes it claim that when God sees that something is good, that indicates that it is perfect, it is just, it is in its best form. But because God loves all of them so much, he punishes the hell out of them. And he loves Eve so much, he punishes her more. It's disgusting. When you read from the English Standard Version, you see this line: "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife," God says to Adam in Genesis 2:17. That's why he punishes Adam at all, because he listened to his wife. It's wrought with the foundations of misogyny and victim blaming that seem to be the backbone of religious ideology and particularly politics today. And it's fucking infuriating. But here are my big questions. If Genesis 1 and 2 are one story and not two contradictory stories, how did the serpent lure first sin at all? Ham's book claims the devil did it and that Satan spoke through the serpent. But in Genesis 1, both the Bible and Ham state that when God saw that his creation was good, that meant it was without flaw. Isn't Satan the flaw? How could Satan have reached into the garden at all? How could the flawless serpent, succumb to the temptation of Satan? How could any of this happen if God was all powerful and made everything perfect and perfectly? Why would God put Adam and Eve into the situation where they had so much chance for failure, plopping them right next to the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And how can an all loving and all forgiving God punish everyone in this situation? He didn't just punish the serpent, he didn't just punish Eve, he didn't just punish Adam. He shouldn't have punished any of them. And never does it say that he punishes Satan, just that he punishes those three. Yet one could interpret that he was in cahoots with Satan the whole time. And if you're going to get into these weird arguments that everyone likes to make, well, God had to do these things because he gave us free will, then it seems that God wanted us tempted. God wanted us to be as close to failure as possible. And if you're someone who's deterministic, who believes that, well, everything goes according to God's plan and that God already had it all laid out, then God wanted this. God wanted to kick Adam and Eve out of the garden. God wanted to tether legs off the serpent. God wanted Satan to get in. God wanted Eve to have horrible childbirth. And God wanted humanity to suffer. God wanted those things. If you're deterministic and you believe that everything has already been decided. And that's fucked up. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around. Uh, while reading this book, again, it is really just the Bible. It's just the printed Bible. But it frustrates the ever loving hell out of me. And I'm so happy that the authors left room for me to write notes because I have so many notes. But I want to let you chew on those questions today, and we'll get deeper into the books of Genesis next time with Adam and Eve's offspring and the curse that affirmed racial inequality. But before I go, I want to leave you with one of my favorite answers in Genesis quotes from this book, because this is a critical review. Cain's wife would have been his sister. This was not forbidden until Leviticus 18 in the time of Moses. I see you, Ham. I see your game. This has been Fables of Our Deconstruction. Fables of Our Deconstruction is created by me, Dylan Jacobson. Please like and review Fables wherever you get your podcasts and join my community, the Brimstone Order, officially a part of Brimstone Studios at patreon.com/Dylan. I'd like to thank Apes of the State for the use of their song Moments a Year From Now as my intro and outro. And remember, you are never alone. We are in this together, and don't spend money on this book. All right, I ended the podcast. I don't see anybody in chat, so I'm gonna bounce today. Thanks for being here. We're gonna read more of that book later. I'm gonna fix my hair and do some laundry. So have yourselves a great rest of your day.